She asked for work, not kindness, but he gave her both.
Then I'll prove I'm worth the trouble.
I am looking for work. I can muck out the stalls. I can brush down the horses. The voice was raspy, stripped of moisture, but it did not shake. Arthur Vance stopped the rhythmic scrape of his whetstone against his hunting knife. He sat perfectly still in the deep shade of his porch, his cold eyes locked on the silhouette that had just broken through the blinding red dust of the Texas plains. She stood at his heavy wooden gate, leading a horse that was little more than a walking skeleton. The woman herself was caked in grime, her face pale, and her lips cracked from the brutal heat. Yet, despite her profound exhaustion, she walked with her spine perfectly straight. Pure, stubborn pride was the only thing holding her upright. But Arthur did not look at her frail frame. His gaze was fixed on two things: the heavy leather holster hanging at her hip. To Arthur, isolation was a fortress. A devastating cholera outbreak had emptied his house years ago, leaving him with one simple rule to survive the frontier: if you do not care for anything, you cannot lose it. He wiped his steel blade on his denim trousers and slid it into its leather sheath. He slowly stood up, fully intending to protect his quiet, empty world. "You are in no condition to work," Arthur said, his voice completely devoid of warmth. "And my place is not a sanctuary for trouble carrying a gun. Keep walking." He turned his back to her, leaving her to the merciless desert.
You can't just walk
"I do not
away.
need your pity," Cora called out, her voice sharpening like shattered glass. "Pay me with a place to sleep in the stable, and that is enough." Arthur did not turn around. His heavy boots hit the porch steps. Desperate to prove her worth, Cora marched toward a heavy bale of hay near the fence. She dug her blistered fingers into the rough twine and heaved with everything she had left. For a fleeting second, the heavy bale lifted. Then, her strength completely vanished. Cora collapsed into the dirt with a heavy thud. The hay bale slammed down beside her, kicking up a cloud of dust. Arthur turned back, a harsh sigh escaping his lips. But as he stepped closer, his breath stopped. The violent fall had torn the collar of her worn cotton shirt open. Beneath the faded fabric, a jagged, fresh bullet wound was carved across her shoulder, actively weeping dark red blood into the dust. She was not just a desperate drifter. She was prey. Arthur stared at the blood. He cursed quietly under his breath. He had sworn he would never let anyone into his life again. But as he looked down at the unconscious woman bleeding out in his yard, he knew he could not leave her to the vultures. He stepped forward and lifted her off the ground. Cora did not stay in the cabin a moment longer than necessary. The very morning her fever broke and the bullet wound scabbed over, she dragged herself out to the stables. She worked with a frantic, punishing rhythm. She shoveled the stalls, hauled heavy wooden buckets of water, and brushed the horses until her calloused hands cracked and bled anew. She was paying off a debt she calculated in her own mind, a debt for the bandages, the medicine, and the roof she refused to sleep under. When the sun dipped below the horizon, dropping the temperature to a bitter chill, she did not return to the warm house. She curled up on a pile of dry hay in the corner of the barn, shivering in the dark. Supper was a silent, heavy affair. They sat at opposite ends of the rough-hewn table in the cabin kitchen. A single oil lamp flickered between them, casting long, restless shadows against the log walls. The silence was absolute, broken only by the scrape of tin forks against wooden plates. Arthur watched her from beneath the brim of his hat. He noticed the way she ate, fast, her eyes constantly darting toward the door, like a wild animal expecting to be struck while it fed. Arthur did not offer words of comfort. He did not know how. Instead, he offered quiet provisions. One morning, Cora found a larger slab of cold, salted meat wrapped in brown paper resting on her work barrel. The next day, a pair of old, sturdy leather boots, freshly stitched to fit her much smaller feet, waited by her pitchfork. Then came the thick wool blanket. Arthur had left it folded neatly on her bed of hay while she was out repairing a fence. For a woman who had spent her life surviving predators, cruelty was expected. Cruelty made sense. Kindness, however, was terrifying. Men did not give without taking. In Cora's dark past, gifts were merely chains disguised as favors. The sight of the heavy wool blanket did not warm her. It sent a cold spike of absolute panic straight through her chest. That evening, as Arthur sat by the cabin fireplace, oiling his rifle, the front door violently swung open. Cora marched in. The wind howled behind her, swirling dust across the floorboards. She clutched
Here's
the
your
wool
blanket.
blanket in her trembling fists
tell me
before
what
throwing
you
it
are
hard onto the
planning.
floor between them.
That's none of your
Her
business.
chest
Get
heaved.
back inside!
Her eyes were wide, with a defensive, desperate fury. "Do not be kind to me," Cora said, her voice shaking with an old, deep-seated terror. "The men who act kind in this country, they always demand a price I cannot pay." Arthur stopped wiping the rifle barrel. He looked at the blanket discarded on the floor, then slowly raised his eyes to meet her scarred, terrified face. He stood up, his towering frame casting a massive shadow across the room. He did not step closer. He recognized the look of a cornered beast, and he knew a sudden movement would only make her bolt. "I do not know what you have been through," Arthur said. His voice was a low, steady rumble, completely empty of the threat she expected. "But I will not have rumors spreading through the valley that my hired hand froze to death because she was not treated properly." He slowly reached down, picked up the blanket, and set it gently on the edge of the dining table. "Take it or leave it," Arthur told her, looking straight into her defensive eyes. "But understand this, Cora. We do not put a price on a life here." The Texas sky shattered without warning. Lightning flashed, followed by a violent clap of thunder that rattled the tin roof of the stable. Inside, the sudden storm terrified the horses. They reared in their narrow stalls, kicking wildly at the wooden gates. Arthur and Cora worked swiftly in the dim lantern light, speaking in low tones to calm the frantic beasts. Then, a deafening crack of thunder split the air right above them. It was sharp. It was brutal. It sounded exactly like a heavy revolver firing in a closed room. Cora froze. The leather lead rope slipped from her hands. The present moment completely vanished, instantly replaced by the suffocating stench of stale whiskey and cigar smoke. Her chest tightened. She stumbled backward, blindly seeking refuge, until her spine hit the wall in the darkest corner of the stable. Her shaking hands reached into her boot, pulling out a hidden iron hunting knife. She curled her knees to her chest, the blade held out in front of her, trembling violently in the shadows. Arthur secured his stall and turned around. His immediate instinct was to step forward and shield her, but he stopped. He saw the wild, cornered look in her eyes. He saw the cold steel reflecting the lightning. Any sudden movement, any attempt to hold her, would only make her fight for her life. Arthur took a deliberate step back, putting empty space between them. Slowly, he bent his knees and sat down on the dusty floorboards. He kept his hands entirely visible. He unbuckled his heavy gun belt and slid the holstered revolver far across the ground, pushing it completely out of his own reach. "I am unarmed," Arthur said, his voice a steady anchor in the roaring storm. "I am staying right here." Cora stared at the discarded gun, then at the quiet man sitting patiently in the dirt. "I do not know who is hunting you, Cora," he told her, his tone unyielding. "But within the borders of this fence, the only storm you need to fear is the one in the sky." The sheer weight of his respect broke the dam. The knife slipped from her exhausted fingers. "His name is Silas," Cora whispered. Her broken voice barely rose above the rain. "He is the sheriff in Oakhaven, a cruel man who uses his badge to take whatever he desires." She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the phantom memories. "He cornered me. I fought back. I grabbed the revolver off his desk and pulled the trigger. The bullet tore straight through his shoulder. I ran into the night. He put a bounty on my head, not for justice, but because I am a wounded animal that dared to bite the master." Arthur sat in the shadows, his jaw clenched tightly. He did not offer empty sympathy. The woman sitting on his floor was not a victim. She was a survivor. The early morning mist still clung to the distant hills, wrapping the valley in a cold, gray shroud. At the western fence line, the rhythmic thud of Arthur's hammer broke the quiet dawn. Cora stood beside him, her calloused hands gripping the wooden post steady. It was a silent, comfortable rhythm they had slowly built together. Then, the hammer stopped mid-air. Arthur narrowed his eyes, staring out across the vast, empty plains. Cora followed his gaze. On the far horizon, a thick plume of red dust churned against the pale sky. A posse of riders was moving fast, heading straight toward the border town of Oakhaven. Even from a distance, the lead rider was unmistakable. He wore a long black duster coat, and his right arm was strapped tightly against his chest in a dark sling. Silas. The heavy wooden post slipped from Cora's hands, hitting the dirt with a dull thud. The blood drained completely from her face. The monster was no longer a ghost in her memories. He was a wolf at the door. Her time had run out. Arthur looked at her trembling hands, his jaw setting into a hard line, but he did not speak. He did not need to. That night, the Vance ranch was swallowed by absolute darkness. The wind whispered through the cracks of the stable, carrying the bitter chill of the desert. Inside, Cora moved like a phantom. She did not light a lantern. Her hands, though shaking violently, moved with desperate purpose as she threw a worn leather saddle over her frail horse. Hot tears cut silent tracks through the dust on her cheeks. She was terrified of the dark, terrified of Silas. But there was one thing she feared far more, the sight of Arthur Vance bleeding out in the dirt because of her. He had given her a safe harbor, when the rest of the world offered only cruelty. She would not let his kindness become his grave. She would ride out, draw the posse away, and surrender to the devil she knew. Cora led the horse out of the barn. The heavy wooden gate was only 10 paces away. Freedom and certain death waited on the other side. "Where do you think you are going?" The voice was a low, dangerous rumble that stopped her dead in her tracks. Arthur stepped out from the deep shadow of the porch. He stood squarely in front of the gate, a massive, immovable wall of bone and muscle. In his right hand, he held his Winchester rifle. He did not point it at her, but the weapon rested against his leg, a silent promise of violence to anyone who dared cross his land. "Step aside, Arthur," Cora said, her voice cracking as she tried to sound resolute. "My work here is done. I am leaving." Arthur did not move a single inch, his piercing eyes locked onto hers through the dark. "You are riding back to the slaughter," he stated, his tone flat and unyielding. Cora dropped the leather reins. The desperate, protective fury she had been holding back finally shattered. She stepped toward him, her hands clenched into fists. "You do not understand," Cora cried out, her voice echoing in the empty yard. "He is already in the town. He has his men with him. When he finds out I am here, he will burn this place to the ground. He will kill you if I stay." The wind howled around them, pulling at Cora's ragged clothes. She stood there, a broken woman offering her own life to save his. Arthur took one slow, deliberate step forward. He looked down at her, his expression completely stripped of fear. He had lost everything once. He refused to do it again. "Then let him try," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a fierce, protective whisper that cut straight through the howling wind. He looked deeply into her tear-filled eyes. "But hear me well, Cora. If you walk out of this gate tonight, you are the one who kills me." The absolute certainty in his words struck her like a physical blow. The heavy burden of her isolation broke.
You anymore,
Cora sank to her knees in the dirt, sobbing into her hands. Arthur did not pull her into an embrace. He knew she was not ready for that, but he knelt in the dust beside her, a silent, unbreakable shield between her and the dark world outside. The afternoon sun baked the dry earth as 6 riders crested the eastern ridge. A thick cloud of red dust billowed behind them, swallowing the horizon. Arthur stood on his front porch. In his left hand he held a steaming tin cup of coffee. His right hand rested casually near his holstered revolver. He watched the riders slow down, forming a menacing half-circle near his wooden fence. The man in the center swung down from his saddle. It was Silas. He wore a tarnished silver star pinned to a dusty leather vest. But Arthur did not look at the badge. His piercing gaze immediately locked onto the sheriff's right arm. The limb was completely stiff, encased in heavy bandages, and suspended tightly against his chest in a black silk sling. Arthur remembered the terrified, weeping woman shivering in his dark barn. I pulled the trigger. The bullet tore straight through his shoulder. Looking at the ruined arm of the corrupt lawman, Arthur's quiet stoicism shifted into a deep, burning contempt. He realized, with absolute clarity, exactly how much courage it took for a cornered, desperate woman to shoot a wolf in its own den. His respect for Cora hardened into an unbreakable shield. Meanwhile, beneath the floorboards of the cabin, the air was freezing and smelled of damp earth. Cora crouched in the pitch-black root cellar, her knees pulled tightly to her chest. She clamped both hands painfully over her mouth to muffle her own ragged breathing. Right above her head, the heavy, rhythmic clinking of silver spurs echoed across the wooden planks. Each footstep sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. Silas was pacing across the porch. Fine trails of dust sifted down through the cracks in the floorboards, landing gently on her trembling shoulders. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the wood to be violently ripped away. Back on the porch, Silas stepped closer to the stairs. His uninjured hand rested heavily on his gun belt. His men watched with predatory grins. "Good afternoon, Vance," Silas drawled, his voice thick with false politeness and chewing tobacco. "We are hunting a fugitive, a dangerous woman, wild and desperate. Have you seen anyone passing through?" Arthur took a slow sip of his black coffee. He did not blink. "I do not entertain guests, Silas," Arthur replied, his voice completely hollow. "And I do not pay attention to the dust blowing past my gate." Silas smiled, a cold, ugly stretching of his scarred lips. He took another step forward, his heavy boot touching the bottom stair of the porch. As he did, his dark eyes caught a flash of white fabric resting on the wooden railing. It was a small cotton handkerchief, washed clean and laid out to dry in the sun. A woman's handkerchief. Silas reached out with his left hand and picked it up. He rubbed the thin fabric between his thick, dirty fingers. The silence in the yard grew suffocating. "You live a lonely life out here, Arthur," Silas whispered. His tone dropped the act, turning into a lethal, quiet threat. He let the handkerchief fall back onto the rail. "A man who hides a criminal will hang from the very same rope." Arthur set his tin cup down on the windowsill. The metallic clink sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence. He picked up the Winchester rifle leaning against the cabin wall. With one fluid, deliberate motion, he pulled the heavy lever down and snapped it back up. The sharp clack-clack of a chambered round echoed across the yard. Arthur leveled his cold, dead gaze directly at the sheriff. "The only rope on my property," Arthur said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that carried absolutely no fear, "is used to tie up wild dogs that wander too close to my fence." Silas stopped moving. The outlaws behind him shifted nervously in their saddles. Arthur had the high ground, a loaded rifle, and a deadly reputation for never missing a target. Silas did not have a search warrant, and he was certainly not willing to die in the dirt today. The sheriff's face twisted with barely contained rage. "We will return, Vance, with the full weight of the law." "Bring a warrant," Arthur replied flatly, "or do not come back at all." Silas turned on his heel, swinging awkwardly back onto his horse. He spurred his mount hard, leading his men away. Arthur did not lower his rifle until the dust swallowed them completely. The pre-dawn light creeping into the cabin kitchen was the color of old iron, gray, cold, and entirely devoid of hope. The fire in the stone hearth had burned down to nothing but dying embers. Cora stood quietly by the cast-iron stove. She looked across the room at Arthur, who was sitting in a heavy wooden chair near the window. He had spent the entire night awake, holding his rifle, keeping watch over the dark yard. He was willing to wage a war against the entire town of Oakhaven just to keep her safe. That was precisely why she had to leave. Silas was not a man who accepted defeat. He was a wounded, humiliated animal wearing a tin badge. He would return with a dozen armed men, torches, and enough ammunition to burn the Vance ranch to ashes. If she stayed, Arthur would fight. And if Arthur fought, he would die. Cora poured boiling water over the ground coffee beans. Her hands trembled as she reached into her apron pocket. She pulled out a small paper packet of sleeping powder, the same medicine Arthur had given her to ease the agony of her gunshot wound. She emptied a heavy dose into his tin cup and stirred it until the white powder dissolved completely into the black liquid. It was a profound betrayal, wrapped in the only form of protection she could offer.
Drink.
Arthur stirred as the bitter aroma filled the room.
You need the warmth.
He rubbed his exhausted eyes and sat up straight. Cora walked over and placed the steaming cup on the table in front of him. "Drink," she said softly. "You need the warmth." Arthur looked up at her. His hardened eyes softened in the dim morning light. He did not hesitate. He did not question her motives. He took the cup in his calloused hands and drank deeply. His absolute, blind trust felt like a physical knife twisting in her chest. Within minutes, the quiet of the kitchen was broken by the clatter of the tin cup hitting the floorboards. The powerful sedative dragged Arthur under. He tried to stand, his muscles fighting the unnatural exhaustion, but his heavy frame betrayed him. He slumped forward, his head resting upon his crossed arms on the wooden table. Cora stood perfectly still until his breathing deepened into a deep, unbreakable slumber. Slowly, she stepped closer to him. She reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers gently brushing through his dark, unruly hair. It was a fleeting, heartbreaking touch, a silent confession of a love that was never allowed to survive. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket and placed it carefully beside his resting hand. Without looking back, she walked out into the freezing dawn, mounted her horse, and rode straight toward Oakhaven, offering herself to the wolves. Hours later, when the sun finally pierced the glass windows, Arthur would wake to an empty house and a single damning note. "You gave me work when I was desperate, and you gave me kindness when I did not deserve it. I will not let that kindness become your grave." At high noon, the border town of Oakhaven was completely deserted. Every shutter was bolted, every door was locked. The townspeople hid in the shadows, choosing blind silence over standing against a corrupt badge. In the center of the dusty square, Silas stood on a rough wooden platform. His ruined right arm remained secured in a black silk sling, and a dozen armed deputies surrounded him. Cora knelt on the rough planks. A thick rope bound her wrists, pulled taut over the heavy execution beam above, suspending her brutally. Her boot tips barely brushed the wood. Every breath tore at her healing shoulder, but she did not cry out. She kept her spine perfectly straight. Silas stepped closer, an ugly smile twisting his scarred face. He placed a thick cigar between his teeth, struck a match one-handed, and blew a cloud of foul smoke directly into her face. "You thought you could run," Silas sneered, his voice echoing off the empty buildings. "But you belong to me, Cora, and I am going to make a very slow, public example out of you." Cora closed her eyes. She ignored the pain. She ignored the mocking laughter. "Arthur is alive," she told herself. He was safe in his quiet stable. That single, comforting truth was worth whatever torment Silas had planned. She bowed her head, entirely ready to accept the darkness. Then, the terrified silence of the town shattered. A single deafening crack of a Winchester rifle tore through the air. Instantly, the cigar in Silas's mouth exploded into a blinding shower of sparks and shredded tobacco. Silas stumbled backward with a shout of shock, clutching his burned face. A second shot rang out. The heavy rope pulled taut above Cora's head, snapped with a sharp whip. The sudden release sent Cora crashing onto the hard wooden platform. She hit the floor heavily, gasping for air as her numb arms fell to her sides. Forcing her eyes open, she looked down the long, dusty street. A massive black stallion stepped into the glaring sunlight. Sitting tall in the saddle was Arthur Vance. He wore a long canvas duster that whipped fiercely in the dry wind. His face was a mask of cold, calculated murder. He did not come alone. Flanking him were 3 heavily armed trackers from his past, answering a call they knew he would only make once. Arthur halted his horse. The outlaws scrambled to draw their weapons, but they froze as Arthur smoothly lowered his smoking rifle. The sharp, metallic clack-clack of a fresh round chambering cut through the silence. Arthur raised his voice, a lethal promise. "I have not fired her yet, Silas. And nobody from the Vance Ranch leaves until the job is done." The dusty square was suffocating. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and gun oil under the late afternoon sun. Arthur Vance did not fire his rifle immediately. He kept his weapon leveled, but his voice boomed across the silent, terrified town, demanding to be heard by the people hiding behind their locked doors. "Open your eyes," Arthur shouted, his voice echoing off the brick walls. "The guilty party is not the bleeding woman on that platform. It is the man wearing a badge to hide the fact that he is a beast. She did not rob him. She shot him to protect herself from his filthy hands." Behind the wooden shutters, the townspeople began to murmur. The fearful silence shifted into uneasy whispers. The heavy, judging stares falling upon Silas made the corrupt sheriff turn pale. He realized his iron grip on the town was slipping. Overcome by rage and public humiliation, Silas pointed his good arm at Arthur. "Kill him! Kill them all!" The square erupted into absolute chaos. Gunfire tore through the air. Arthur and his 3 companions dove behind a heavy wooden wagon, returning fire with lethal precision. However, Silas had too many men. The sheer volume of lead raining down upon Arthur's position began to pin them down, forcing them back into a blind corner. Up on the execution platform, Cora saw the man she loved fighting a losing battle. She refused to be helpless. Using the last ounce of her strength, she dragged her bound hands toward a rusted iron bracket on the edge of the wood, desperately trying to saw through the thick rope. Suddenly, a shadow fell over her. A woman holding a small child stepped out from the narrow alleyway beside the gallows. She was trembling violently, terrified of the flying bullets, but her eyes held a fierce determination. She pulled a small paring knife from her apron, knelt beside Cora, and sliced the thick rope completely in half. The two women locked eyes. It was a silent, profound understanding between two souls who knew the profound cruelty of the frontier. "Do not die," the woman whispered, pressing the knife into Cora's hand. "Live for the rest of us." Cora nodded. She rolled off the platform and hit the dirt. Snatching a heavy revolver from the holster of a fallen deputy, she immediately joined the fight, firing 2 rapid shots to cover Arthur's flank. Through the thick, blinding gun smoke, Cora saw him. Silas had slipped through the shadows. He raised his revolver, aiming directly at Arthur's unprotected back. There was no time to shout. There was no time to think. Cora threw herself across the open space. Bang! The bullet did not hit Arthur. It tore straight into Cora's abdomen. She collapsed into the bloody dust, the revolver slipping from her fingers. "Cora!" Arthur dropped his Winchester rifle. He did not care about the gunfire. He sprinted through the crossfire and slid into the dirt, gathering her broken body into his arms. It was the very first time he had ever held her. The warmth of her small frame pressed against his chest was agonizing, accompanied by the terrifying sight of dark blood soaking through her shirt. He thought his first embrace would be his last. "I told you not to walk out of that gate," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling as tears finally broke through his hardened eyes. "You fool." A dark shadow fell over them. Silas stood a few feet away, a wicked smile on his face as he aimed his gun down at them. "Time to die, Vance." Before Silas could pull the trigger, a massive gunshot echoed from the edge of town. The revolver in Silas's hand was blasted away, leaving his fingers shattered. "Stop!" a commanding voice roared. A United States Marshal, flanked by a dozen heavily armed cavalrymen, rode furiously into the square. They did not look at Cora. They completely surrounded the corrupt sheriff. "Silas," the marshal announced, his voice carrying the absolute weight of the law, "you are under arrest for abuse of power, gross harassment, and the embezzlement of state funds. Put him in irons." Silas was thrown face first into the dirt, his tin badge ripped from his chest. He was dragged away in chains, humiliated in front of the very town he had terrorized. The gunfire ceased completely. The greatest danger was finally gone. Cora lay in Arthur's arms, her breathing shallow but steady. She looked up at his panicked face, and for the first time in her life, her eyes were filled with absolute peace. Arthur lifted her gently, mounted his black stallion, and rode like the wind back to the only place that mattered. Days later, the midday sun bathed the Vance Ranch in a warm, golden light. Cora opened her eyes. She was lying in the large bed inside the cabin. The bullet had been successfully removed. It was not deep enough to take her life. Sitting in the wooden chair beside her was Arthur. He was carefully wrapping a fresh white bandage over her wound. He looked exhausted, but the cold, grumpy isolation that used to define his face had completely vanished. He met her gaze, and a slow, gentle smile touched his lips. "You still owe me a week of mucking out the stalls," Arthur told her quietly. Cora smiled back, her hand reaching out to interlock with his calloused fingers. She was finally safe. She came to his door, asking for nothing but work, but she ended up building a home. If this tale of redemption and frontier romance captured your heart, do not let the journey end here. Hit that subscribe button and join the Wild West Love Stories channel. We bring you epic, cinematic tales of outlaws, lone riders, and the fierce women who steal their hearts. Leave a comment below. Would you have risked it all like Arthur did? See you in the next adventure.